The judge looked at me over his glasses and said the words that made the entire courtroom gasp. "Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, please step forward to claim your inheritance." Every head turned toward me as I stood up from the back row, my hands trembling, slightly as I smoothed down my simple navy dress. My ex-husband Richard's face went white as a sheet. His new wife Victoria actually dropped her designer purse. What they didn't know was that I had been waiting for this moment for 3 long years, and the secret I'd kept buried was about to change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began. 3 years ago, I was Eleanor Blackwood, a 62-year-old woman who thought she knew what the rest of her life would look like. I had been married to Richard for 34 years, raised 2 children who had moved across the country for their careers, and spent most of my days tending to our small garden behind our modest 2-story home in Salem, Oregon. Richard worked as a bank manager, and I had given up my teaching career 28 years earlier when our daughter Sarah was born. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, or so I thought. Richard's father, William Blackwood, was a different story entirely. The man owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Portland and had built an empire from a single hardware store he'd inherited from his own father back in the 1960s. William was cold, calculating, and had never much cared for me. He thought his son had married beneath his station when Richard brought home an elementary school teacher from a working-class family. For 3 decades, he barely acknowledged my existence at family gatherings, referring to me as Richard's wife, rather than using my name and making it clear that he considered me an unfortunate addition to his bloodline. The relationship between Richard and his father was complicated. William had always been demanding, expecting Richard to eventually take over the family business, but Richard had chosen banking instead, much to his father's disappointment. Still, Richard was the only son, and everyone just assumed that when William passed away, everything would go to Richard. The old man had never remarried after Richard's mother died when Richard was in college, and he had no other children. It seemed like simple math. I remember the last conversation I had with William clearly. It was at his 80th birthday party, held at the country club where he'd been a member for 40 years. I had spent the entire afternoon helping organize the event, making sure the flowers were arranged properly, coordinating with the catering staff, and greeting guests as they arrived. William barely spoke to me the entire day, but as the party was winding down, he pulled me aside near the coat. "Check. Eleanor," he said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking cigars. "You've been a dutiful wife to my son." I waited for him to continue, expecting perhaps the first compliment he'd ever given me. Instead, he looked me directly in the eyes and said, "But duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect." At the time, I thought he was just being his usual cryptic, unpleasant self. I smiled politely, told him I hoped he'd enjoyed his party, and didn't think much more about it. William died 6 months later. It was sudden, a heart attack in his study on a Tuesday morning in March. Richard found him when he went to check on him after William had missed their weekly breakfast meeting. The funeral was elaborate, befitting a man of his standing in the community. Business leaders, politicians, and society figures filled the cathedral downtown. I wore my black dress, the same one I'd worn to my own mother's funeral 2 years earlier, and sat in the front row next to Richard, playing the role of the grieving daughter-in-law. What happened next changed everything. The will reading was scheduled for the following Friday at William's attorney's office. Richard was nervous but excited. We had talked about what we might do with the inheritance, maybe take that trip to Europe we'd always dreamed of, or finally renovate our kitchen. Richard had even mentioned the possibility of early retirement. The attorney, a stern man named Mr. Harrison, who had handled William's affairs for 20 years, had requested that both Richard and I attend the reading. The office was impressive, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books, the kind of place that smelled like old money and important decisions. Richard and I sat across from Mr. Harrison's massive mahogany desk while he adjusted his reading glasses and opened a thick manila folder. "Before we begin," Mr. Harrison said, "I should mention that Mr. Blackwood's will contains some unusual provisions. I encouraged him several times to reconsider certain aspects, but he was quite firm in his decisions." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What kind of unusual provisions?" he asked. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading. "To my son, Richard James Blackwood, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal effects, including my watch collection and the contents of my study." Richard's face went confused. $50,000 was nothing to sneeze at, but it was a fraction of what everyone expected. Mr. Harrison continued reading through various small bequests to charities and longtime employees, but the bulk of the estate, the real estate empire, the investment portfolios, the business interests, remained unaccounted for. Then came the bombshell. The remainder of my estate, including all real property, business holdings, and financial assets, estimated at a value of approximately $12.7 million, I leave to be held in trust. Richard leaned forward, assuming he would be named as the beneficiary of the trust. But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. "This trust shall be administered by Harrison, Klein and Associates, with all assets to be managed and preserved for a period of no less than 3 years from the date of my death." 3 years? Richard interrupted. "What happens after 3 years?" Mr. Harrison looked up from the document, his expression unreadable. "After the 3-year period has elapsed, the trust assets will be distributed according to conditions that Mr. Blackwood specified in a sealed envelope, which is not to be opened until that time arrives." He held up a thick, cream-colored envelope with William's distinctive wax seal. "Your father was very explicit that these instructions were not to be disclosed to anyone, including myself, until the designated time." Richard was stunned. "So we just—" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Wait, for 3 years? Without knowing what's going to happen to the money?" Mr. Harrison nodded. "That is correct. In the meantime, the trust will continue to generate income through the various business operations and investments. That income will be used to maintain the properties and grow the principal." I sat there feeling oddly calm while Richard grew more agitated by the minute. Something about the whole situation felt familiar, like I was watching a play I'd seen before. William had always been a man who liked control, who enjoyed keeping people guessing. This felt exactly like something he would do. Dangle the inheritance. Just out of reach, making everyone wait and wonder. The drive home was tense. Richard alternated between anger and confusion, running through theories about what his father might have been thinking. "Maybe it's a test," he said. "Maybe he wanted to see how we'd handle the uncertainty." I listened and made appropriate sounds of agreement, but honestly, I was thinking about that strange conversation with William at his birthday party. Duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect. The words kept echoing in my head. Life continued, but the uncertainty cast a shadow over everything. Richard became obsessed with trying to figure out his father's plan. He spent hours going through William's papers, looking for clues. He called Mr. Harrison's office repeatedly, hoping to get some hint about what might be in that sealed envelope. He even hired a private investigator to look into his father's activities in the months before his death, thinking there might be some indication of his intentions. Meanwhile, I went about my normal routine. I tended my garden, volunteered at the local library, and had lunch with my friend Margaret every Thursday. But I was thinking about William, about the way he'd looked at me during that conversation, about the careful way he'd chosen his words. There had been something deliberate about it, something that felt like he was trying to tell me something without actually saying it. About 6 months after William's death, Richard started talking about the future differently. "You know," he said one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner, "when this all gets sorted out, when I inherit everything, I think we should make some changes." I asked him what kind of changes he had in mind. "Well, we'll be wealthy, Eleanor, really wealthy. We'll be able to afford a different kind of life." Over the following weeks, those conversations became more frequent and more specific. Richard talked about buying a house in an exclusive neighborhood, joining the country club where his father had been a member, traveling extensively. But the way he talked about these plans made me uncomfortable. He used a lot of I statements. "I think I'll buy that house on Riverside Drive. I've always wanted to own a boat. I could finally start that consulting business I've been thinking about." When I pointed out that we would be making these decisions together, Richard would laugh and pat my hand in a way that felt condescending. "Of course, dear. I just meant that I'll be handling the financial aspects. You know you've never been good with money." That stung, partly because it wasn't true. I had managed our household finances for decades, and partly because it felt like the beginning of something I didn't like. The real shift came about a year after William's death. Richard had become increasingly distant, working late more often, taking weekend trips to Portland that he claimed were related to monitoring the trust's business interests. When he was home, he seemed distracted, always on his phone, always busy with something that didn't include me. Our conversations became perfunctory, limited to logistics about meals and schedules and household maintenance. Then I started noticing small changes in his appearance and behavior. New clothes, more expensive than anything he'd ever bought before. A new cologne that I didn't recognize. He joined a gym and started talking about networking opportunities and expanding his social circle. When I asked if I could join him for some of these social events, he would make excuses about why it wouldn't be appropriate or why I wouldn't enjoy it. One evening in late spring, Richard came home from one of his Portland trips looking different somehow. Happier, more energetic than I'd seen him in months. Over dinner, he was unusually talkative, telling me about a gallery opening he'd attended. A wine tasting event? A dinner party at someone's penthouse. The way he described these events made it clear that he was moving in circles that were far removed from our normal life in Salem. "Richard," I said carefully, "these sound like wonderful experiences. I'd love to go with you sometime." He paused with his fork halfway to his mouth and gave me a look I'd never seen before. It was almost pitying. "Eleanor, honey, I don't think you'd really fit in with that crowd. They're very sophisticated. It's mostly business people, investors, people who understand finance and art and, well, it's just not really your world." That comment hit me like a physical blow. After 34 years of marriage, my husband was essentially telling me that I wasn't good enough for his new lifestyle. I finished my dinner in silence, went upstairs, and sat on the edge of our bed for a long time, trying to process what was happening to my marriage. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place over the summer. Richard's behavior became more erratic and secretive. He would receive phone calls that he would take in private, stepping out onto the patio or going into his study and closing the door. He started going to Portland 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes staying overnight. When I asked about these trips, he became defensive, accusing me of being suspicious and clingy. One particularly hot July afternoon, I was in the garden watering my tomatoes when our neighbor Mrs. Chen came over to chat. She was a sweet woman in her 70s who had lived next door for 15 years. We often talked over the fence about our gardens and our families. That day, she seemed a bit uncomfortable, fidgeting with her gardening gloves as we talked. "Eleanor," she said finally, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with you and Richard?" I assured her that everything was fine, but she looked skeptical. "It's just that I've seen him leaving at odd hours lately, and last week I saw him loading suitcases into his car at 6 in the morning. I was worried that maybe one of you is sick or something." I thanked Mrs. Chen for her concern and told her there was nothing to worry about, but her observation troubled me. Richard hadn't mentioned any early morning trips. That evening, I casually asked him about his schedule for the next day, and he told me he was planning to work from home. When I mentioned that Mrs. Chen had seen him leaving early the previous week, he became agitated and accused me of having the neighbors spy on him. The conversation escalated into our first real fight in years. Richard accused me of being paranoid and controlling. I accused him of being secretive and dishonest. Eventually, he stormed out of the house saying he was going to Portland for the night and would be back in the morning. He didn't come back for 3 days. When he finally returned, he was different. Calmer, but also more distant. He sat me down at the kitchen table and spoke in the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. "Eleanor, I think we need to have a serious conversation about our future. This marriage isn't working anymore. We've grown apart. We want different things, and I think it would be better for both of us if we separated." I stared at him across the table. This man I'd shared my life with for over 3 decades, and realized I was looking at a stranger. "Richard, what are you talking about?" "Yes, things have been difficult lately, but that doesn't mean we give up. We can work through this. We can get counseling, we can—" He was shaking his head before I finished speaking. "Eleanor, I've already contacted a lawyer. I've thought about this a lot and I've made up my mind. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between us, like a challenge. "I've been unhappy for a long time, and I think you have been too, even if you won't admit it. We're different people than we were when we got married. I want a chance to start over, to live the kind of life I want to live." "What kind of life is that, Richard?" I asked, though I was already beginning to understand. "The kind of life where you're embarrassed by your wife, where you go to fancy parties and art galleries and pretend you're someone you're not." His face flushed, and I knew I'd hit close to the mark. "I'm not pretending to be anyone," he said defensively. "I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be. And that person doesn't include a small-town housewife who's never been anywhere or done anything interesting." The cruelty of that statement took my breath away. A small-town housewife. After 34 years of supporting his career, raising his children, managing his household, being his partner in every meaningful way, that's how he saw me. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. Richard had indeed been planning this for months. He had documented every asset we owned, consulted with multiple attorneys, and developed a strategy for dividing our property. Since Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, the specifics of why our marriage had ended didn't matter legally, only the division of assets. What I learned during those proceedings shocked me even more than his initial announcement. Richard had been living a double life for over a year. He had rented an apartment in Portland, joined an exclusive social club, and had been spending money, our money, maintaining a lifestyle that was far beyond our actual means. He had run up credit card debt, taken out a home equity loan on our house, and had been using our savings to fund his new persona. But the most devastating revelation came when Richard's attorney presented their proposed settlement. Because I had not worked outside the home for most of our marriage, and because the bulk of our assets were tied up in property and investments that Richard had managed, his legal team argued that I was entitled to only a minimal share of our joint assets. They proposed giving me the house, which sounded generous until I realized it came with all the debt Richard had accumulated against it. They also offered me half of our remaining savings, which amounted to less than $30,000 after Richard's spending spree. The piece of information that hurt the most was buried in the financial disclosures. Richard had been having an affair. Her name was Victoria Sterling, and she was everything I was not. 20 years younger, a successful art dealer, sophisticated, beautiful, and very much part of the social circle Richard was so desperate to join. They had met at a gallery opening 8 months earlier, and according to the timeline presented by Richard's attorney, their relationship had begun shortly after that first meeting. My attorney, a competent but overworked woman named Sandra Mills, looked over the proposed settlement and shook her head. "Eleanor, this is not a fair division of assets. You contributed to this marriage for 34 years. You deserve much more than this." But when we tried to negotiate, Richard's legal team was ruthless. They had documentation showing that Richard had been the primary breadwinner throughout the marriage, that all major financial decisions had been made by him, and that I had no direct involvement in building the wealth we had accumulated. The truth was, I had very little leverage. The house was underwater due to the loans Richard had taken out. Our joint savings had been depleted. The only significant asset on the horizon was Richard's potential inheritance from his father's trust, but that was still more than a year away. And there was no guarantee what that inheritance would even include. During one particularly contentious negotiation session, Richard's attorney made an offer that revealed just how little respect Richard had left for me. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, sliding a document across the table, "my client is prepared to be generous. He's willing to give you the house free and clear, along with $50,000 in cash, in exchange for you signing away any potential claim to future assets, including any inheritance he might receive from his father's estate." I stared at the document, understanding immediately what this meant. Richard was so confident that he would inherit his father's millions that he was willing to pay me to give up any claim to that money. In his mind, $50,000 was a small price to pay to ensure that I couldn't touch the real wealth. That was coming. My attorney advised me to reject the offer. "Eleanor, if Richard inherits even half of what everyone expects, $50,000 will look like pocket change. You should maintain your claim to marital assets, including potential inheritances." But I was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of being portrayed as a greedy ex-wife trying to steal money I hadn't earned. Tired of watching Richard transform into someone I didn't recognize. Against my attorney's advice, I signed the agreement. I took the house, the $50,000, and walked away from any claim to Richard's future. Sandra Mills looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Eleanor, you could be giving up millions of dollars. Are you sure about this?" I told her I was sure. What I didn't tell her was that I had a feeling Richard might not be inheriting as much as he thought he was. The divorce was finalized on a gray October morning. Richard looked pleased and confident as we signed the final paperwork. He was already planning his new life with Victoria, already spending money he didn't yet have. Outside the courthouse, he actually had the audacity to shake my hand and tell me he hoped I would be happy. "You'll see, Eleanor," he said. "This is better for both of us. You can have a simple life, the kind you're comfortable with, and I can finally live up to my potential." I moved back into the house that was now entirely mine, along with its underwater mortgage and the weight of 34 years of memories. Richard moved to Portland permanently and began living openly with Victoria. Within 6 months, they were engaged. The society pages of the Portland newspaper covered their engagement party, complete with photos of Richard in a tuxedo and Victoria in a designer gown, surrounded by the kind of people Richard had always aspired to impress. I spent that winter quietly, learning how to live alone for the first time in decades. I paid down the debt on the house using the settlement money, got a part-time job at the local library, and tried to build a life that made sense without Richard in it. It was lonely, but it was also peaceful. No more walking on eggshells, no more feeling like I wasn't good enough, no more pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Spring brought news that Richard and Victoria had set a wedding date for early summer, just 2 months before the 3-year waiting period for William's trust would end. It was clear that Richard was timing everything perfectly. He would marry his sophisticated new wife, inherit his father's fortune, and begin the glamorous life he'd always believed he deserved. But I wasn't thinking about Richard's wedding plans. I was thinking about something else entirely, something that had been nagging at me for 3 years ever since that conversation with William at his birthday party. I had replayed that moment hundreds of times in my memory, analyzing every word, every inflection, every subtle expression on the old man's face. Duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect. What if that hadn't been a general observation about life? What if it had been a specific message, meant specifically for me? What if William, who had spent 30 years watching his son treat me with casual disregard, who had seen firsthand how Richard took my loyalty and support for granted, had decided to do something about it? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that William's mysterious trust provisions weren't random. They were intentional, calculated, and they might not be what everyone expected them to be. But I kept these thoughts to myself. If I was right, there would be time, enough to find out. If I was wrong, well, it wouldn't matter anyway. Richard and Victoria's wedding was the social event of the summer in Portland. The photos in the newspaper showed a lavish ceremony at the country club where William had celebrated his 80th birthday. Victoria looked stunning in her designer gown, and Richard looked like he had finally found the life he'd always wanted. In his interview with the Society reporter, he mentioned that they were looking forward to a bright future together, with some significant family business to attend to in the coming months. I didn't attend the wedding, obviously, but I did receive an invitation which struck me as either incredibly tasteless or deliberately provocative. I threw it away without opening it fully, but not before I noticed that it was printed on the most expensive paper money could buy, with gold embossing and hand calligraphy. Richard was clearly spending money as if he already had access to his father's millions. Summer passed into fall, and as September arrived, I found myself thinking more and more about the approaching deadline. In just 2 months, the 3-year waiting period would end, and Mr. Harrison would finally open William's sealed envelope. Richard had been calling the attorney's office weekly, trying to get information about when exactly the reading would take place and what the procedures would be. Finally, in mid-October, the call came. Mr. Harrison's secretary contacted me to inform me that the final distribution of William Blackwood's estate would take place on Friday, November 15th at 2 p.m. in the law firm's conference room. I was invited to attend as Richard's former wife, though the secretary made it clear that this was likely just a formality and that I shouldn't expect the proceedings to affect me in any way. I accepted the invitation, though I didn't tell anyone I was planning to attend. As far as I knew, Richard and Victoria had no idea I would be there. They were probably expecting a simple ceremony where Mr. Harrison would hand over the keys to William's empire and they would walk out as one of the wealthiest couples in Oregon. The days leading up to November 15th crawled by. I found myself alternating between nervous excitement and the certainty that I was building up false hope. Most likely, I told myself, William's trust would be exactly what everyone expected it to be. Richard would inherit everything, and I would sit in the back of that conference room watching my ex-husband become a very wealthy man with his very young wife. But there was another possibility, a possibility that kept me awake at night and made my heart race during quiet moments. What if William, who had never liked the way his son treated me, who had watched for 30 years as Richard took my devotion for granted, who had always been a man who believed in consequences and accountability, had decided to teach his son a lesson about duty and loyalty and the value of a good woman? There was only one way to find out. The morning of November 15th arrived gray and drizzly, typical for Oregon in late fall. I woke up before dawn, not because I had set an alarm, but because my mind wouldn't let me sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain tap against my bedroom window, thinking about how different this day might have been if Richard and I were still married. We would have gotten ready together, probably arguing about what to wear to such an important occasion. He would have been nervous and excited, pacing around the house, checking his watch every few minutes. Instead, I was alone with my thoughts, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared out at my small garden. I had been thinking a lot about gardens lately. There's something profound about tending plants, about understanding that growth takes time, that sometimes the most important work happens underground where nobody can see it. When I first started gardening 35 years ago, Richard used to tease me about spending so much time with dirt and weeds. He never understood that gardening taught you patience, taught you to recognize the difference between something that was dormant and something that was dead, taught you that the right conditions could make even the most unlikely things flourish. By noon, I had changed clothes 3 times. I wanted to look respectable, but not overdressed, confident, but not presumptuous. I finally settled on a charcoal gray dress with a simple black blazer, clothes that would let me blend into the background if that's where I belonged, but that wouldn't embarrass me if I ended up being more visible than expected. I added my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable jewelry I owned, and a pair of low heels that wouldn't betray me if my legs got shaky. The drive to Portland took 45 minutes, and I spent most of it practicing what I would say if anyone asked me why. I was there. I had every right to attend. Mr. Harrison's office had invited me, but I knew my presence would surprise people. Richard probably assumed I was too bitter or too proud to show up, or maybe he had simply forgotten that his ex-wife might have any interest in his family's affairs. Victoria probably didn't even know I existed beyond being an unfortunate chapter in Richard's past that he preferred not to discuss. Harrison, Klein, and Associates occupied the top 2 floors of a gleaming downtown office building. The lobby was all marble and brass, designed to impress clients with the firm's success and stability. I announced myself to the receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair who looked at me with polite disinterest. She checked her computer screen and directed me to the conference room on the 32nd floor. The elevator ride felt endless. I watched the numbers climb and tried to calm my racing heart. Whatever happened in the next hour would either validate 3 years of secret hope or confirm that I was a foolish old woman who had built a fantasy around a dying man's cryptic comment. Either way, I told myself, at least I would know. The conference room was larger than I had expected, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of the city and the mountains beyond. A long polished table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Mr. Harrison was already there, arranging papers and looking as serious as he had 3 years earlier. He nodded politely when I entered and gestured toward a chair near the back of the room. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said formally, "thank you for coming. Please, make yourself comfortable. The others should be arriving shortly." I took the seat he had indicated and tried to look like I belonged there. The view from the window was mesmerizing, but I forced myself to focus on the room and the people who would soon fill it. Richard arrived exactly 5 minutes before the scheduled start time, which was typical for him. He had always been punctual to the point of obsession, believing that being late showed disrespect and lack of discipline. He was dressed in an expensive navy suit that I didn't recognize, with a silk tie that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. His hair had been recently cut and styled, and he moved with the confident bearing of a man who was about to inherit a fortune. Victoria entered behind him like a perfectly choreographed dance partner. She was even more striking in person than she had appeared in the newspaper photos. Tall and elegant with honey blonde hair that fell in perfect waves around her shoulders. Her outfit was a masterpiece of understated luxury, a cream-colored dress, with a designer handbag and shoes that probably had their own insurance policy. She moved through the room as if she had been born to occupy spaces like this, comfortable and entitled in a way that I envied despite myself. Richard's eyes swept the room and stopped when they reached me. His expression shifted from confident anticipation to surprised confusion. "Eleanor?" he said, his voice louder than the formal setting warranted. "What are you doing here?" Every head in the room turned toward me, and I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I had hoped to remain unnoticed until the proceedings began, but apparently that wasn't going to be possible. "I was invited," I said simply, keeping my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. Mr. Harrison's office called me last week. Richard looked toward the attorney with an expression that demanded an explanation. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and consulted the papers in front of him. Mrs. Blackwood was indeed invited, he confirmed. Your father's instructions were quite specific about who should be present for the final distribution. Everyone listed in the original will was to be notified and given the opportunity to attend. Richard's confusion deepened, but he didn't pursue the matter further. He guided Victoria to seats at the opposite end of the table from me, and they sat down with the air of people claiming their rightful place at the head of the proceedings. The room gradually filled with other attendees. There was Mr. Klein, Mr. Harrison's partner, who would apparently serve as a witness to whatever was about to unfold. William's longtime accountant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had managed the financial aspects of the trust for the past 3 years. A representative from the bank that had been handling the trust's day-to-day operations. And finally, a court reporter who set up her equipment with practiced efficiency. At exactly 2 o'clock, Mr. Harrison called the meeting to order. He stood at the head of the table, holding the cream-colored envelope that had been sealed for 3 years, and addressed the assembled group with the gravity of a judge pronouncing sentence. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the final distribution of the estate of William James Blackwood, pursuant to the terms of his last will and testament. As you know, Mr. Blackwood's instructions were that this sealed envelope not be opened until exactly 3 years from the date of his death. That deadline has now passed, and we may proceed. He paused and looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each face as if he were memorizing this moment for history. Before I open these instructions, I want to remind everyone present that Mr. Blackwood was of sound mind when he created these provisions, that he consulted extensively with our firm about the legal implications of his decisions, and that his wishes, however unexpected they might prove to be, are legally binding and will be carried out to the letter. Richard shifted impatiently in his chair. Victoria placed a manicured hand on his arm in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting, but looked more possessive to me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, trying to appear calm while my mind raced with possibilities. Mr. Harrison opened the envelope with a letter opener that looked like it had been designed specifically for ceremonial purposes. He extracted several sheets of paper, unfolded them carefully, and began to read. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed his eyebrows rise slightly as he scanned the contents. He read through the entire document once, then looked up at the assembled group. These instructions are quite detailed, he said, and I believe it would be best if I read them in their entirety rather than attempting to summarize. He cleared his throat and began. To those gathered for the distribution of my estate, I hope you will understand that the decisions I have made were not arrived at lightly or in haste. I have spent considerable time observing the people in my life, evaluating their character, their choices, and their treatment of others. What follows is my final judgment on how my life's work should be distributed. Richard leaned forward, his attention completely focused on Mr. Harrison's words. Victoria maintained her composed expression, but I could see tension in the set of her shoulders. I tried to keep my breathing steady and my face neutral. To my son, Richard James Blackwood, I have already provided a bequest of $50,000 and my personal effects. This bequest reflects my assessment of his character and his worthiness to inherit the wealth that I spent my lifetime accumulating. Richard, you have shown yourself to be a man who values appearance over substance, who discards loyalty in favor of opportunity, and who measures success by how others perceive you rather than by the content of your character. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Richard's face went white, then flushed deep red. Victoria's perfect composure cracked, and she looked toward her husband with an expression of shock and growing panic. Mr. Harrison continued reading in the same steady, professional tone, as if he were reciting stock prices rather than delivering. A devastating judgment. Your treatment of your wife Eleanor during your marriage, and particularly during your divorce, revealed everything I needed to know about the kind of man you have become. Eleanor supported your career, raised your children, managed your household, and stood by you through every challenge for 34 years. In return, you lied to her, betrayed her trust, abandoned her for a younger woman, and attempted to cheat her out of her fair share of the assets you built together. Richard tried to interrupt, but Mr. Harrison held up his hand and continued, reading. You may believe that your personal life is irrelevant to business matters, but I have always believed that a man who cannot honor his commitments to his family cannot be trusted with anything of real value. A man who discards a loyal wife like an outdated piece of furniture is not a man who deserves to control the legacy I built through decades of hard work and sacrifice. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic far below. Richard's breathing had become audible, sharp, and rapid, like a man who had just received terrible news from a doctor. Victoria's hand had moved from his arm to grip the edge of the table, her knuckles showing white through her perfectly tanned skin. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison continued, your behavior since my death has only confirmed my assessment of your character. You have lived beyond your means, accumulated debt in anticipation of inheriting wealth you had not yet received, and conducted yourself as if my money was already yours to spend. You have shown no respect for the work it took to build this estate, no appreciation for the responsibility that comes with wealth, and no consideration for anyone whose interests might conflict with your own desires. Mr. Harrison paused and took a sip of water from a glass beside his papers. Richard looked like he might be sick. Victoria was staring at the attorney with the intensity of someone trying to will him to say something different. I maintained my neutral expression, but inside, I felt a growing sense of vindication mixed with genuine sadness for the pain that was being inflicted, even if it was deserved. Therefore, Mr. Harrison resumed, I have decided that Richard will inherit nothing further from my estate. The $50,000 he has already received, along with my personal effects, represents the entirety of his inheritance. I hope that this decision will serve as an education in the consequences of treating others with disrespect and dishonesty. Richard shot to his feet so abruptly that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. This is impossible, he shouted. He can't do this. I'm his only son. I'm his only heir. This has to be a mistake. Mr. Harrison looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had anticipated this reaction. Mr. Blackwood, I understand your shock, but I assure you there is no mistake. Your father was very explicit in his instructions, and he anticipated that you might challenge his decisions. He included extensive documentation of his reasoning, including detailed records of your financial behavior over the past 3 years, and sworn statements from several witnesses regarding your treatment of your former wife. Victoria found her voice for the first time since the reading began. This is outrageous, she said, her carefully modulated tone cracking slightly. William was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote this. No father would completely disinherit his only son over a divorce. There has to be some legal recourse, some way to contest this. Mr. Klein, who had been silent until now, spoke up from his position near the window. Mrs. Blackwood, I can assure you that Mr. William Blackwood was thoroughly examined by medical professionals before finalizing these instructions. We have documentation from 2 independent physicians confirming his mental competency at the time these decisions were made. Additionally, he consulted with 3 separate law firms to ensure that his wishes could not be successfully challenged in court. Richard collapsed back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The confident, successful man who had entered the room 30 minutes earlier had been replaced by someone who looked lost and desperate. But what about the business? He asked weakly. What about the properties? What about everything he built? It can't just disappear. Mr. Harrison consulted his papers again. That brings us to the distribution of the remainder of the estate. Your father was very clear about his wishes in this regard as well. He looked up from the document, and his eyes found mine across the room. The entire remainder of William, James Blackwood's estate, including all business holdings, real estate properties, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, currently valued at approximately $15.2 million, is to be distributed to Eleanor Marie Blackwood. The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. I felt as if the room had tilted on its axis, as if gravity had suddenly reversed direction. Every person in the room was staring at me, but I couldn't seem to process what I had just heard. $15.2 million. To me, Eleanor Marie Blackwood, the small-town housewife who had never been anywhere or done anything interesting. Richard's voice, when he finally found it, was barely above a whisper. Eleanor? He left everything to Eleanor? But she's not even family anymore. She's my ex-wife. She signed away any claim to my inheritance. She has no right to my father's money. Mr. Harrison looked at him with something that might have been pity. Mr. Blackwood, your former wife signed away her claim to assets that you might inherit. She made no agreements regarding assets that might be left directly to her. Your father was free to leave his estate to anyone he chose, and he chose Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. He turned back to his papers. He was quite specific about his reasoning in this matter as well. My hands were shaking as Mr. Harrison continued reading. Eleanor, you have shown dignity, loyalty, and grace under circumstances that would have broken many people. You supported my son for 34 years, asking for nothing in return but basic respect and consideration. When he betrayed you and abandoned you, you conducted yourself with a dignity that he has never possessed. When you were offered the opportunity to fight for a larger share of the marital assets, including potential inheritance, you chose instead to walk away with grace rather than engage in a bitter battle that would have enriched only the lawyers. I realized I was crying, tears running down my cheeks that I didn't even try to wipe away. The words William had written about me were more kindness than anyone had shown me in years, certainly more than I had ever received from him while he was alive. Your decision to sign away your claim to future inheritance was not the action of a weak woman, as my son believed, but the action of someone with such inner strength that she was willing to sacrifice potential wealth rather than compromise her dignity. That kind of character is rare in this world, and it deserves to be rewarded. You were the daughter-in-law I never appreciated while I was alive, but you are the person I trust most to use this inheritance wisely and well. Victoria was on her feet now, her designer composure completely shattered. This is insane, she screamed. She's nobody. She's just some pathetic old woman who couldn't keep her husband. William must have been having some kind of breakdown when he wrote this. We'll contest it. We'll fight this in court. She won't see a penny of that money. Mr. Harrison set down his papers and looked at her with the cold professionalism of someone who had dealt with many ugly scenes over the years. Mrs. Blackwood, you are certainly free to pursue legal action if you believe you have grounds to do so. However, I should inform you that Mr. William Blackwood anticipated such a response and took extensive precautions to ensure his wishes could not be overturned. The estate has more than sufficient resources to defend against any legal challenge. And frankly, you have no standing to contest a will in which you are not mentioned. Richard looked like he was struggling to breathe. Eleanor, he said, turning toward me with an expression of desperate pleading. You can't seriously accept this. This is my father's money, my family's money. You know this isn't right. You know he meant for me to inherit everything. And something went wrong, some misunderstanding. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if he were convincing himself. We can work this out between us. We don't need lawyers. We can come to some reasonable arrangement. I found my voice for the first time since Mr. Harrison had spoken my name. "Richard," I said quietly, "your father was very clear about his intentions. This isn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This is exactly what he wanted to happen." I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady but functional. "Mr. Harrison, what do I need to do to accept this inheritance?" The attorney smiled for the first time since I had entered the room. "Mrs. Blackwood, there are quite a few documents to sign and legal procedures to complete, but those can be handled over the next few days. For now, you simply need to confirm that you accept the bequest as outlined in Mr. William Blackwood's will." "I accept," I said, the words coming out stronger and clearer than I had expected. "I accept the inheritance, and I will do my best to honor William's trust in me." Richard made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a sob. Victoria gathered her purse and headed for the door without looking back, her high heels clicking angrily against the marble floor. "Eleanor, please," Richard said one more time, his voice breaking. "You can't do this to me. To us. We'll lose everything. The house, the wedding, all our plans. Victoria's pregnant. We need this money." I looked at him across the conference table. This man who had shared my life for over 3 decades, who had thrown me away like garbage when I was no longer useful, to him, who was now begging me to save him from the consequences of his own choices. "Richard," I said gently, "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself. Your father watched you treat me like I was disposable, and he decided that a man who could do that to his wife didn't deserve to inherit the fortune he had worked his entire life to build. This isn't about revenge or punishment. This is about consequences." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him cycling through anger, disbelief, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. Finally, he nodded, once stood up, and walked toward the door. Just before he reached it, he turned back. "I guess I never really knew you at all, did I, Eleanor?" he said. It wasn't an accusation or an insult, just a statement of fact that carried 34 years of regret. "No," I replied. "You never did." He walked out of the conference room, leaving me alone with the lawyers and the court reporter and the most shocking news I had ever received in my life. "Mr. Harrison began gathering his papers, but he paused and looked at me with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Blackwood, I have to tell you that I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I have never seen anything quite like this. Your former father-in-law was a complex man, not always easy to like, but he was a shrewd judge of character. I think he would be very pleased to see how you handled yourself today." I thanked him and asked about the next steps. There would be meetings with accountants and financial advisors, paperwork to transfer property deeds and investment accounts, decisions to make about the ongoing management of William's various business interests. It was overwhelming to contemplate, but also strangely exciting. For the first time in my adult life, I would have real choices about how to live, what to do with my time, how to use my resources to make a difference in the world. As I walked out of the conference room and toward the elevator, I thought about William's final words to me at his birthday party. Duty doesn't always get rewarded the way people expect. He had been trying to tell me something that day, planting a seed that would take 3 years to bloom. He had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, something worth $15 million and a chance to start over. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I began the descent back to street level, back to my simple life in Salem, back to my small house and my garden and my part-time job at the library. But everything had changed now. I was no longer Eleanor Blackwood, the discarded wife who had been too proud or too stubborn to fight for what she deserved. I was Eleanor Blackwood, the inheritor of a fortune that would allow me to live any kind of life I chose. The rain had stopped while I was inside, and late afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds as I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel for several minutes, not ready to drive yet, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. It was short and to the point. Congratulations on your inheritance. I hope you'll be very happy, Victoria. I deleted the message without responding. The drive home gave me time to think about what I wanted to do with this unexpected gift. William had trusted me to use his wealth wisely, and I intended to honor that trust. There would be time for travel, for experiences I had never been able to afford, for the kind of life Richard had thought I wasn't sophisticated enough to appreciate. But first, there were other things to consider. People to help, causes to support, ways to make a difference that went beyond my own comfort, and happiness. I thought about my garden, about the lessons it had taught me over the years. Sometimes the most unlikely plants could flourish if they were given the right conditions. Sometimes what looked dead was just dormant, waiting for the right season to bloom. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grew from the darkest soil. By the time I reached Salem, I had already begun making plans. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed expecting to discover that the entire inheritance had been an elaborate dream. But the business card from Mr. Harrison was still sitting on my nightstand, and my phone contained 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Word had somehow gotten out about the will reading, and apparently the local media found the story of a spurned ex-wife inheriting millions from her former father-in-law too delicious to ignore. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at my small garden while I tried to figure out how to handle the sudden attention. The phone rang again, and this time I answered it. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, identifying herself as Jessica Chen from the Portland Tribune. She wanted to know if I would be willing to give an interview about my unexpected inheritance and my relationship with the Blackwood family. I politely declined and hung up, but the phone rang again immediately. This time it was a producer from a local television station, asking essentially the same questions. I realized that ignoring the calls wasn't going to make them stop, so I turned off the phone and retreated to my garden, where I could think without constant interruption. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and dying leaves. I walked among my flower beds, most of them dormant now, for the winter, and tried to wrap my mind around the magnitude of what had happened. $15 million. It was an abstract number that didn't feel real, like play money from a board game. But the business interests and properties were very real, and they would require real decisions and real management. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, appeared at the fence that separated our yards, carrying a cup of tea and wearing the expression of someone who had news to share. She had obviously seen the reporters who had been lurking around my house earlier that morning, and her curiosity was practically vibrating in the air between us. "Eleanor, dear," she said carefully, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but there seem to be some unusual people interested in your house today. Is everything all right?" I explained briefly about the inheritance, watching her eyes grow wider with each detail. Mrs. Chen had known Richard during our marriage, and she had watched the divorce proceedings with the concerned interest of a good neighbor. She knew better than most how badly I had been treated. "Well," she said finally, "I can't say I'm surprised that Richard's father saw through him. That man always struck me as someone who could read people like books, and you've certainly earned some good fortune after everything you've been through." She paused and sipped her tea thoughtfully. "What will you do now?" It was a simple question, but it contained multitudes. What would I do now? For 62 years, my life had been shaped by other people's needs and expectations. First my parents, then Richard, then our children, then the demands of maintaining a household and supporting a husband's career. I had never in my adult life had the luxury of asking myself what I wanted to do with my time, my energy, my resources. I told Mrs. Chen that I wasn't sure yet, that I needed time to process everything and make some plans. She nodded understandingly and went back inside, but I could see her watching from her kitchen window as I continued working in my garden. News travels fast in small towns, and I knew that by evening, everyone in Salem would know about my inheritance. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and paperwork. Mr. Harrison introduced me to William's financial advisors, a team of serious men and women who spoke in numbers and percentages and long-term projections. They walked me through the various components of the estate: commercial real estate holdings in Portland and Seattle, a diversified stock portfolio, municipal bonds, a small but profitable manufacturing company that made specialized hardware for construction projects, and several other business interests that generated steady income. The most surprising discovery was a beautiful house in the hills above Portland, a property that William had owned for 15 years but rarely used. It was a sprawling contemporary home with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city and Mount Hood beyond. The property manager, a efficient woman named Carol Martinez, gave me a tour that left me speechless. The house was fully furnished with expensive but tasteful furniture, artwork that belonged in museums, and a kitchen that would have made professional chefs weep with envy. Mr. Blackwood used this primarily as a retreat, Carol explained as, "We walked through rooms that were larger than my entire Salem house. He would come here when he needed to think, to get away from the demands of business. He always said it was the one place where he could see clearly." She paused in the living room, which featured a massive stone fireplace and windows that framed the view like a living painting. He left specific instructions that you should feel free to use this house whenever you wanted, for as long as you wanted. I stood in that beautiful room, looking out at a view that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and felt a wave of emotion that caught me completely off guard. William had not only left me his fortune, he had left me a home that was worthy of that fortune. A place where I could live the kind of life that Richard had always believed I wasn't sophisticated enough to appreciate. That evening, I drove back to Salem and sat in my small house, trying to reconcile the woman who had toured a mansion that afternoon with the woman who had been making dinner in this modest kitchen for the past 3 years. The contrast was jarring, but also liberating. I could choose now. I could stay in Salem and live quietly on the income from the investments, or I could embrace the opportunities that this inheritance represented. The decision was made easier by what happened next. Richard called me for the first time since the will reading, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of desperation that was impossible to miss. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just to talk, to see if there was some way to work things out. Against my better judgment, I agreed to see him. We met at a small cafe in downtown Salem, the same place where we used to have breakfast sometimes, during the early years of our marriage. Richard looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was uncombed, and he had the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who hadn't been sleeping. He ordered coffee but didn't touch it, just sat across from me fidgeting with the cup handle while he tried to find the right words. "Eleanor," he began, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know I treated you badly, that I hurt you in ways that can't be undone. But I'm asking you to consider what my father really would have wanted if he had known the whole situation." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Victoria is pregnant. We're going to have a baby. My father always wanted grandchildren, and if he had known that there was going to be a grandchild, surely he would have made different provisions." I looked at this man who had once been the center of my world, who had fathered my children, and shared my bed for over 3 decades, and felt nothing but sadness for how far he had fallen. "Richard," I said gently, "your father knew exactly what he was doing. He watched you abandon your family for a younger woman, and he decided that wasn't the kind of behavior that deserved to be rewarded with $15 million. But the baby," Richard insisted, "surely you wouldn't want to punish an innocent child for my mistakes. Victoria and we made plans based on the assumption that I would inherit something substantial. We bought a house we can't afford. We've accumulated debts. We're in over our heads financially. Without some portion of that inheritance, we're going to lose everything." I thought about the house in the Portland Hills, about the businesses that were generating income every day, about the investment accounts that were growing steadily even as we spoke. Richard was asking me to give up a fortune so that he could maintain the lifestyle he had built on the assumption that his father's money would always be there to bail him out. "Richard," I said, "you made your choices. You chose to leave our marriage. You chose to spend money you didn't have. You chose to build a life based on expectations rather than reality. Those were your decisions, and now you have to live with the consequences." I stood up to leave, but he grabbed my arm. "Eleanor, please. I'm begging you. Just a portion of it. Just enough to get us back on our feet. $1 million would solve all our problems. You'd still have 14 million left. You could afford to be generous." The desperation in his voice was painful to hear, but it also made me angry. Even now, even when he was asking for my help, he was trying to tell me what I could afford, trying to manage my money for me. "Richard," I said, pulling my arm free from his grip, "this conversation is over. The inheritance is mine, and I intend to keep it. You made your bed when you decided I wasn't good enough for your new life. Now you get to sleep in it." I walked out of the cafe without looking back, but I could feel his eyes following me all the way to my car. That night, I called Carol Martinez and asked if the Portland house was available for an extended stay. She assured me that it was, and that she would have it prepared for my arrival. I spent the next day packing my belongings, not just for a visit, but for a move. Salem had been my home for 3 years, but it had never been the life I wanted. It had been the life I accepted after Richard took away all my other options. The process of packing forced me to confront how small my world had become. My clothes fit in 2 suitcases. My books filled 3 boxes. My personal mementos and photographs occupied 1 small crate. In 3 years of living alone, I had accumulated almost nothing of value, had formed few meaningful relationships, had built a life that was functional but not fulfilling. Mrs. Chen came over to say goodbye, bringing a plate of homemade cookies and tears in her eyes. "I'm going to miss you terribly," she said. "But I'm so happy that you're finally getting the chance to live the life you deserve." She hugged me tightly and whispered, "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for accepting. Good fortune. You've earned this, Eleanor." The drive to Portland felt like crossing a bridge between 2 different worlds. I left Salem as Eleanor Blackwood, the quiet divorcee who worked part-time at the library and tended a small garden. I arrived in Portland as Eleanor Blackwood, one of the wealthiest women in Oregon and the owner of properties and businesses that she was only beginning to understand. The Portland house was even more spectacular at sunset, the massive windows catching and reflecting the golden light that painted the city below. Carol had prepared the master suite for me, a room with its own fireplace, a balcony that overlooked the garden, and a bathroom that was larger than my entire Salem kitchen. But it was the closet that made me laugh out loud. It was bigger than my old bedroom, with built-in drawers and shelves and hanging space for hundreds of garments. It was designed for someone who owned the kind of wardrobe that went with a $15 million lifestyle. That night, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine from William's impressive collection, looking out at the lights of the city and trying to plan my future. The financial advisors had prepared a comprehensive report on the estate's assets and income streams. Even if I spent lavishly, the investments would generate more money than I could reasonably use. I could travel, buy anything I wanted, live anywhere in the world, and still have more money at the end of each year than I had started with. But money, I was learning, was just a tool. The real question was what I wanted to build with that tool. For the first time in my adult life, I had complete freedom to choose my path, and the responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. The answer came to me gradually over the following weeks as I settled into my new life. I hired a personal shopper to help me build a wardrobe appropriate for my new circumstances, not because I cared about fashion, but because I realized that How I presented myself would affect how seriously people took me. I enrolled in a financial literacy course at Portland State University, determined to understand every aspect of my inheritance rather than simply trusting others to manage it for me. Most importantly, I began exploring the city and the opportunities it offered for someone with resources and time to make a difference. I visited homeless shelters, food banks, literacy programs, and domestic violence organizations. I attended charity galas and fundraising events, observing how wealthy people use their resources to support causes they cared about. It was at one of these events, a fundraiser for a women's shelter, that I met Dr. Sarah Martinez, a social worker who had dedicated her career to helping women escape abusive relationships. She was passionate and articulate, explaining how lack of resources kept women trapped in dangerous situations. Many of the women who came to the shelter had no money, no job skills, and nowhere to go. They needed not just temporary housing, but education, training, and support to build independent lives. The real tragedy, Dr. Martinez told me over dinner after the fundraiser, is that we know how to solve these problems. We know what these women need to succeed, but we never have enough funding to provide comprehensive services. We can offer them a bed and a hot meal, but we can't offer them a real chance to change their lives. I went home that night thinking about Dr. Martinez's words, about women who were trapped by circumstances and lack of options, about the difference that real resources could make in their lives. I thought about my own situation 3 years earlier, when I had been financially vulnerable and emotionally devastated, dependent on Richard's willingness to be fair in our divorce settlement. I had been lucky. I had owned half a house and had enough savings to survive on my own. But what if I hadn't? What if I had been completely dependent on Richard's generosity? The idea that began forming in my mind was ambitious and would require a significant commitment of both money and time. But for the first time since inheriting William's fortune, I felt excited about something bigger than myself. I called Dr. Martinez the next morning and asked if we could meet for lunch. Over soup and sandwiches at a quiet restaurant near the university, I outlined my proposal. I wanted to fund a comprehensive program for women leaving abusive relationships, something that would provide not just emergency shelter, but job training, education assistance, childcare, counseling, and transitional housing. I wanted to create a path that would take women from crisis to self-sufficiency, giving them the tools and resources they needed to build independent, successful lives. Dr. Martinez listened with growing excitement as I described my vision. "Eleanor," she said finally, "what you're talking about would be revolutionary. A program like that could change hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. But the startup costs alone would be enormous. We're talking about multiple facilities, full-time, staff, ongoing operational expenses. It would require millions of dollars and years of development." "I have millions of dollars," I reminded her, "and I have years of life left to devote to something meaningful. The question is whether you think it's feasible, whether you would be willing to help me develop and run such a program." Dr. Martinez's eyes filled with tears. "Eleanor, I've been dreaming about something like this for my entire career. I've written grant proposals. I've pitched the idea to foundations. I've begged wealthy donors for support. Everyone always says it's a wonderful idea, but the funding never materializes. If you're serious about this, if you really want to commit the resources necessary to make it work, then yes, absolutely, I would love to help you create it." We spent the next 3 hours sketching out preliminary plans, discussing the various components the program would need, and identifying potential locations for the facilities. By the time we parted, I had committed to funding a feasibility study and hiring Dr. Martinez as a consultant to develop a comprehensive proposal. Oversati. The following months, our informal lunch conversation evolved into a serious business plan. We assembled a team of experts, architects to design facilities, educators to develop training programs, financial advisors to structure the funding, and lawyers to handle the legal framework. We visited similar programs in other cities, studying what worked and what didn't, learning from their successes and failures. The project consumed my days and filled my dreams. I had found something worthy of William's trust, something that would use his fortune to create lasting change in the world. But as we moved closer to the launch of the program, I discovered that my new life was attracting attention from some unexpected quarters. Richard called me again in March, 6 months after the will reading. This time, his voice carried a different tone, less desperate but more calculating. He had learned about my involvement with the Women's Shelter Project, probably from the society pages that had begun covering my charitable activities. "Eleanor," he said, "I've been reading about your foundation work. It's very admirable, very generous of you. I'm proud of what you're doing with the money." The words sounded sincere, but I could hear something else underneath them. Something that made me wary. "Thank you, Richard," I said carefully. "It's important work, and I'm grateful to be able to support it." "I was wondering," he continued, "if you might be interested in having some professional advice about managing such a large charitable undertaking. Victoria has been working with some very successful nonprofits in her art dealing business, and she has connections with people who could help you maximize the impact of your donations." I almost laughed out loud at the transparent attempt to insert himself and Victoria into my new life. "Richard, I appreciate the offer, but I have excellent advisors already. I don't need any additional help." Of course," he said. Quickly. "I just thought, given our history, given that we share children, that maybe we could find a way to work together on something positive. This could be an opportunity for us to rebuild our relationship, to show our kids that we can still be a family even after everything that's happened. Our children." Richard was invoking our children, using them as leverage to try to gain access to the fortune he had lost. It was a low tactic, even for him, and it made me angry in a way that his earlier desperation had not. "Richard," I said, my voice sharper than I had intended, "our children are adults with their own lives. They don't need us to pretend to be a happy family for their benefit. And they certainly don't need to see their father trying to manipulate their mother into sharing an inheritance that he forfeited through his own poor choices." "Eleanor, that's not what I'm doing," he protested. But we both knew it was exactly what he was doing. "I just think it would be better for everyone if we could find a way to move forward together instead of separately." "We moved forward separately when you decided you wanted a divorce," I reminded him. "You made it very clear that you didn't want me in your new life." "Well, congratulations, Richard. You got what you wanted. You have your new wife, your new baby, and your new life. And I have mine." I hung up the phone and realized that my hands were shaking not from fear or sadness, but from anger. Richard still saw me as someone he could manipulate, someone whose resources he could access if he just found the right approach. He had not learned anything from losing his inheritance, had not gained any insight into why his father had chosen to disinherit him. He was still the same selfish, entitled man who had thrown away 34 years of marriage for a younger woman and a more exciting lifestyle. But I was not the same woman he had divorced. I was not the quiet, accommodating wife who had spent decades deferring to his judgment and accepting his assessment of my worth. I was Eleanor Blackwood, a woman with the resources and the determination to build something meaningful with her life, and I was not going to let Richard or anyone else diminish that accomplishment. The phone call with Richard clarified something important for me. This new life I was building was not just about having money or living in a beautiful house or wearing expensive clothes. It was about having the power to make choices based on my own values and priorities, rather than adapting myself to someone else's expectations. It was about using the gifts I had been given to create something lasting and worthwhile, something that would matter long after I was gone. William had seen something in me that I had not seen in myself, something that Richard had never valued. He had recognized that I was someone who could be trusted with real responsibility, someone who would use power wisely rather than selfishly. His inheritance was not just a gift, it was a challenge, an opportunity to prove that his assessment of my character had been correct. I was determined not to disappoint him. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Eleanor Blackwood Center for Women's Independence took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I had inherited William's fortune. The media turnout was impressive, with reporters from newspapers, television stations, and online publications documenting what they called the largest private investment in women's services in Oregon's history. Standing behind the podium, looking out at the crowd of supporters, donors, and future residents, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the lives that would be changed by this facility. Dr. Martinez stood beside me as I addressed the gathering, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen an impossible dream become reality. The center would house up to 40 women and their children at any given time, providing not just emergency shelter, but a comprehensive 18-month program that included job training, educational support, childcare, counseling, and transitional housing assistance. We had hired a staff of 23 full-time professionals, from social workers to career counselors to childcare specialists, and we had partnerships with local colleges and businesses to provide educational opportunities and job placement services. The facility itself was impressive without being ostentatious, a modern 3-story building designed to feel like a home rather than an institution. Each family unit had its own private space, but there were also common areas for meals, meetings, and activities. The children's areas were bright and cheerful, with play spaces and learning centers designed by child development experts. The job training facilities included a commercial kitchen where residents could learn culinary skills, a computer lab for office training, and workshop spaces for learning various trades. As I spoke about the center's mission and goals, I noticed a familiar figure in the back of the crowd. Richard stood near the parking area, partially hidden behind a news van, watching the proceedings with an expression I couldn't quite read. He was alone, no sign of Victoria or their baby, and he looked older than his 58 years. Our eyes met briefly across the distance, and I saw something in his face that might have been regret, or perhaps just the recognition of an opportunity forever lost. After the ceremony, as I was greeting supporters and answering questions from reporters, Richard approached me. He waited patiently until the crowd around me had thinned, then stepped forward with the careful posture of someone who knew he wasn't entirely welcome. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "congratulations on this achievement. It's truly remarkable what you've built here." His words seemed genuine, lacking the calculated desperation of our previous conversations. I wanted to apologize for my behavior over the past year. I know I've said and done things that were inappropriate, and I wanted you to know that I understand now why my father made the choices he did. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but found only what appeared to be sincere remorse. "Thank you, Richard," I said carefully. "That means more than you might realize." "Victoria and I separated 3 months ago," he continued, his voice barely audible above the noise of the departing crowd. "The financial pressure, the stress of everything that happened, it was too much for our relationship to survive. She moved back to California with the baby." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've had a lot of time to think about the choices I made, about the way I treated you, about what I threw away when I decided our marriage wasn't good enough for me." I felt an unexpected pang of sadness for him. This man who had once been my partner in everything, who had lost not just his inheritance but his new family as well. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles, Richard. I hope you and Victoria can work out something that's best for your child." "The baby isn't mine," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if he had been holding them back for months. "Victoria told me 3 weeks before she left." Apparently, she was involved with someone else before she ever met me, and she was never sure about the paternity. When we lost the inheritance, when our financial situation became impossible, she decided it was time to be honest about everything. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, not because I cared about Richard's personal life anymore, but because I understood what it meant. Richard had destroyed his marriage to me, forfeited his inheritance, and ruined his relationship with his children, all for a woman who had been deceiving him from the beginning. The cosmic justice of it was almost too perfect to be real. "Richard," I said gently, "I don't know what to say. That must have been devastating for you." And I meant it. Despite everything he had done to me, despite the pain he had caused and the callous way he had discarded our life together, I could not find it in my heart to take pleasure in his suffering. It was, he admitted, but it was also clarifying. It made me realize that I've been chasing the wrong things for years, trying to be someone I'm not, trying to live up to some fantasy of success and sophistication that was never really me. He looked up at the center behind me, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "What you've built here, this is real. This matters. This is the kind of legacy that actually means something." We stood in awkward silence for a moment. Two people who had shared a lifetime together but who now existed in completely different worlds. Finally, Richard extended his hand toward me. "I hope you'll be very happy, Eleanor. You deserve all the good things that are coming your way." I shook his hand, feeling the finality of the gesture. "I hope you find your way to a better place, too, Richard. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." He nodded, turned, and walked back toward the parking area without looking back. I watched him go, feeling not vindication or anger, but a deep sadness for all the ways that people can lose themselves in pursuit of the wrong dreams. The months following the center's opening were among the most fulfilling of my life. I spent several days each week at the facility, not as a distant benefactor, but as an active participant in the program. I taught financial literacy classes, sharing the hard-won knowledge I had gained about managing money and making sound financial decisions. I worked with the career counselors to develop job placement programs, using my connections in the business community to create opportunities for graduates of our program. Most importantly, I spent time with the women themselves, listening to their stories, offering encouragement, and serving as living proof that it was possible to rebuild a life after devastating setbacks. Many of them were surprised to learn that the woman who had funded their program was herself a divorce survivor, someone who had experienced financial vulnerability and emotional betrayal. My story gave them hope that their current circumstances were not permanent, that with the right support and opportunities, they could create better futures for themselves and their children. One of the women who made a particularly deep impression on me was Maria Santos, a 34-year-old mother of two who had fled an abusive marriage with nothing but the clothes on her back and her determination to protect her children. Maria was intelligent and hardworking, but she had never had the opportunity to develop job skills that would allow her to support her family independently. Her husband had controlled every aspect of their finances, never allowing her to work outside the home or to have access to their bank accounts. Maria threw herself into the center's programs with an intensity that was inspiring to watch. She enrolled in our computer training course, attended every financial literacy session, and volunteered to help with childcare for other residents while she wasn't in class. Within 6 months, she had completed certifications in office administration and bookkeeping, and she had been hired as an assistant manager at a local accounting firm. But Maria's transformation went beyond job skills and financial independence. She regained her confidence, her sense of self-worth, her belief that she deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. She became a mentor to newer residents, sharing her experience and offering practical advice about navigating the challenges of starting over. Watching her evolution from a frightened, broken woman to a confident, self-sufficient professional was more rewarding than any business success I had ever experienced. The center's success attracted attention from other cities and organizations interested in replicating our model. I received invitations to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to addressing domestic violence and homelessness. Academic researchers asked to study our programs and publish papers about our outcomes. Government officials visited to learn about best practices that could be incorporated into public policy. The recognition was gratifying, but it also created new opportunities and responsibilities. A coalition of women's organizations in Seattle asked me to consider funding a similar facility in their city. A group in San Francisco presented a proposal for a program that would focus specifically on women aging out of the foster care system. A nonprofit in Denver wanted to explore adapting our model for rural communities where resources were scarce and distances were vast. Each proposal represented thousands of women who needed help, communities that could be strengthened, lives that could be transformed. But each also represented a significant financial commitment and a major expansion of my philanthropic activities. I found myself in the unexpected position of having to choose between multiple worthy causes, of having to decide how to allocate resources that seemed limitless but were ultimately finite. The decision-making process forced me to think more strategically about my charitable giving. I hired a team of experts to help me evaluate proposals, conduct due diligence on potential partners, and develop systems for monitoring the effectiveness of funded programs. I established the Blackwood Foundation as a formal entity, with professional staff and rigorous procedures for grant-making and program evaluation. The foundation work was intellectually challenging in ways that I had never experienced before. I had to learn about social policy, program evaluation, nonprofit management, and impact measurement. I attended courses at the university, hired tutors to help me understand complex research studies, and traveled to visit successful programs in other parts of the country. For the first time in my life, I was using my mind in ways that felt fully engaged and deeply satisfying. But the personal rewards of the work went far beyond intellectual stimulation. Every month brought new stories of women who had graduated from our programs and were thriving in their new lives. Maria Santos sent me updates about her career progress and her children's achievements in school. Jennifer Walsh, a former teacher, who had been homeless after leaving an abusive relationship, was now working as an educational coordinator for a literacy program. Carmen Rodriguez had started her own catering business after completing our culinary training program. These success stories were not just statistics or feel-good anecdotes. They represented fundamental changes in the trajectory of families, children who would grow up seeing their mothers as strong and independent, communities that were strengthened by the contributions of skilled and confident women. The ripple effects of the investment extended far beyond the individual women we served. The foundation's growing reputation also brought me into contact with other philanthropists and social entrepreneurs, people who were using their resources to address various social problems. I found myself part of a community of donors who shared information, collaborated on initiatives, and supported each other's work. These relationships challenged me to think more broadly about social change and to consider how different approaches could complement each other. One of the most intriguing partnerships emerged from a conversation with David Chen, a tech entrepreneur who had sold his company and was using the proceeds to fund educational initiatives. David had developed a successful program that provided college scholarships and mentoring for first-generation college students, and he was interested in exploring connections between educational opportunity and domestic violence prevention. "Eleanor," he said during a dinner meeting at my Portland house, "I've been reading about your work with the Women's Center, and I'm fascinated by the way you've addressed the economic factors that keep women trapped in abusive situations. I'm wondering if there might be opportunities to prevent some of those situations by providing educational and economic opportunities for young women before they become vulnerable to predators." The conversation sparked ideas about expanding our programming to include prevention as well as intervention. We began developing a partnership that would provide college scholarships and career mentoring for young women who had aged out of foster care or who came from families with histories of domestic violence. The goal was to give these young women the educational and professional foundations they would need to maintain their independence and avoid the economic vulnerabilities that often led to abusive relationships. The prevention programming required a different approach from our residential services, focusing on long-term mentoring relationships and sustained support through college and early career development. But the theoretical framework was the same, providing women with the resources and opportunities they needed to control their own destinies. As the Foundation's work expanded, I found myself traveling frequently to visit programs, meet with potential partners, and speak at conferences. The travel was eye-opening, exposing me to different approaches to social problems and different models of philanthropy. I visited women's cooperatives in Guatemala, microfinance programs in Bangladesh, and educational initiatives in rural Mississippi. Each experience broadened my understanding of the ways that poverty, violence, and discrimination affected women's lives around the world. But it was during a trip to Washington, D.C., where I was attending a conference on nonprofit innovation, that I encountered the most unexpected reminder of my past life. I was having dinner at a restaurant near my hotel when I noticed a familiar figure at a table across the room. Victoria Sterling, Richard's former wife, was dining with a man I didn't recognize, her blonde hair styled differently than I remembered, her manner more subdued than the confident woman I had seen at the will. Reading, our eyes met across the restaurant, and after a moment of hesitation, Victoria approached my table. She looked older, more tired, but still beautiful in the way that money and good genetics could create. "Eleanor," she said hesitantly, "I hope you don't mind the interruption. I wanted to say hello and to apologize for my behavior during the will reading. I was shocked and angry, and I said things that were unfair and unkind." I gestured for her to sit down, curious about what had brought about this unexpected encounter and apparent change of heart. "Thank you for the apology, Victoria. That was a difficult day for everyone involved. I've been following your work with the Foundation," she continued, "and I wanted you to know how impressed I am with what you've accomplished. Richard was wrong about a lot of things, but he was especially wrong about you. You've built something remarkable with that inheritance." We talked for nearly an hour, and I learned that Victoria's life had taken several unexpected turns since her separation from Richard. She had moved back to California to be closer to her family while raising her daughter, and she had struggled to rebuild her art-dealing business after the financial disasters of her marriage. She spoke candidly about the mistakes she had made, the ways that greed and ambition had led her to make poor choices about relationships and financial planning. "I thought Richard's inheritance would solve all my problems," she admitted. "I thought marrying him would give me access to a lifestyle that I couldn't afford on my own. I was so focused on the money that I never really considered whether we were compatible as people, whether we could build a sustainable relationship based on something more than financial convenience." Her honesty was refreshing, and I found myself feeling sympathy for this woman who had played such a destructive role in my marriage. Like Richard, she had been chasing an illusion of success and happiness that had ultimately left her worse off than when she started. "The irony," Victoria continued, "is that watching what you've done with that money has taught me more about real wealth than all my years in the art world ever did. You've used your resources to create something lasting, something that improves other people's lives. That's a kind of success that I never understood before." As we parted that evening, Victoria handed me her business card and mentioned that she was working with several California nonprofits on art therapy programs for trauma survivors. "If the Foundation is ever interested in incorporating creative programming into your services," she said, "I would love to explore ways to contribute. I can't undo the damage I caused, but maybe I can find ways to use my skills for something more meaningful than just making money." The encounter with Victoria stayed with me for weeks afterward, serving as a reminder of how the events of 3 years earlier had affected not just my life, but the lives of everyone involved. Richard had lost his inheritance, his marriage, and his relationship with his children. Victoria had lost her financial security and her illusions about what constituted a successful life, but both of them seemed to be learning from their mistakes, finding ways to rebuild their lives on more solid foundations. The contrast between their struggles and my own flourishing was not lost on me. William's gift had given me not just financial resources, but the opportunity to discover parts of myself that had been dormant during my marriage. The shy, accommodating wife who had deferred to Richard's judgment had been replaced by a confident woman who could make complex decisions, manage large projects, and inspire others to achieve their potential. But perhaps the most significant change was in my understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. During my marriage, I had measured my worth by how well I supported Richard's career and maintained our household. Success meant keeping everyone happy and avoiding conflict. Now I measured my worth by the impact I could make on other people's lives, by the problems I could solve and the opportunities I could create. The foundation work had given me a sense of purpose that was both deeply personal and broadly significant. Every day brought new challenges that required me to learn, grow, and stretch beyond my comfort zone. Every success story from our programs reminded me that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, that one person's generosity could create ripple effects that lasted for generations. As the third anniversary of William's death approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years earlier, I had been a discarded wife with no clear future and limited resources. Now I was a philanthropist with the power to change lives, a community leader whose opinions were sought on important issues, a woman who had built something meaningful from the ashes of her previous life. The transformation had not been easy or automatic. It had required me to overcome decades of conditioning that had taught me to doubt my own judgment and defer to others. It had demanded that I learn new skills, take calculated risks, and step into roles that felt unfamiliar and sometimes intimidating, but each challenge had made me stronger, more confident, more capable of handling whatever came next. Looking back, I could see that William had understood something about me that I had not understood about myself. He had recognized potential that had been suppressed by circumstances and relationships, capabilities that had never been fully utilized or appreciated. His inheritance had been more than a financial gift. It had been an investment in the person he believed I could become. The realization filled me with gratitude not just for the money, but for the faith he had shown in my character and judgment. He had bet $15 million on my ability to use his resources wisely, and I was determined to prove that his confidence had been well placed. As I prepared for the Foundation's annual gala, an event that would showcase our achievements and raise additional funds for expansion, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction with the life I had built. The woman who had sat in that conference room 3 years earlier, shocked to learn she had inherited a fortune, had evolved into someone who could command a room full of influential donors, speak confidently about complex social issues, and inspire others to join her mission. The gala would be held at the Portland Art Museum, a venue that seemed appropriate for celebrating the intersection of resources and vision that had made our work possible. The guest list included business leaders, government officials, nonprofit, executives, and Foundation program graduates who had agreed to share their stories with potential donors. The evening would culminate with the announcement of our plans for national expansion, an initiative that would establish Eleanor Blackwood centers in 5 additional cities over the next 3 years. Standing in my closet, selecting a gown for the evening, I thought about how different my life would have been if Richard had inherited his father's fortune as everyone expected. I would still be living quietly in Salem, probably still working, part-time at the library, still defined primarily by my relationship to a man who had never fully appreciated what I had to offer. Instead, I was preparing to host an event that would raise over $2 million for programs that had already changed hundreds of lives. I was wearing a designer dress that I had chosen not to impress others, but because I felt confident and powerful in it. I was about to address an audience of people who respected my judgment and valued my leadership. William had been right when he told me that duty didn't always get rewarded the way people expected. Sometimes it got rewarded, in ways that were far better than anyone could have imagined. The annual Blackwood Foundation Gala exceeded every expectation I had dared to set. The Portland Art Museum had been transformed into an elegant showcase of our mission, with displays featuring the artwork created by women in our art therapy programs, photographs documenting the construction and opening of our facilities, and interactive presentations showing the measurable impact of our services on the community. The evening raised $3.4 million, surpassing our goal by nearly 40% and providing the resources needed to accelerate our national expansion plans. But the real triumph of the evening came during the testimonial portion of the program, when Maria Santos took the podium to address the assembled crowd of donors and supporters. She stood before an audience that included some of the most powerful people in Oregon, wearing a navy blue dress she had purchased with money from her new job, her children sitting proudly in the front row. Her voice was steady and confident as she described her journey from a frightened abuse survivor to a successful business professional and the role that the center had played in making that transformation possible. 3 years ago, Maria told the hushed audience, I arrived at the Eleanor Blackwood Center with 2 small children, no money, no job skills, and no hope for the future. I was convinced that I was worthless, that I deserved the treatment I had received, that I would never be capable of supporting my family or contributing anything meaningful to society. She paused, her composure never wavering. Tonight, I stand before you as the assistant manager of a successful accounting firm, the owner of my own home, and the proud mother of 2 children who are thriving in school and in life. That transformation was made possible by a woman who understood that everyone deserves a second chance, everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, and everyone has potential that can flourish with the right support. The standing ovation that followed Maria's speech lasted nearly 5 minutes, and I noticed that many people in the audience were wiping away tears. But I was watching Maria herself, marveling at the confidence and grace she displayed while addressing a room full of strangers. This was the same woman who had barely been able to make eye contact during her intake interview, who had apologized for taking up space and asking for help. Her transformation represented everything I hoped to achieve through our programs. After the formal program concluded, I mingled with guests and potential donors, discussing expansion plans and answering questions about our programming model. The conversations were energizing, filled with enthusiasm for the work we were doing and genuine interest in supporting our mission. Several attendees approached me with ideas for additional partnerships and collaborative initiatives that could enhance our services. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd was beginning to thin, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the museum's entrance, apparently waiting for an opportunity to speak with me. My daughter Sarah had flown in from Boston for the gala, something I had not expected given the strained nature of our relationship since the divorce. She looked elegant in a black cocktail dress, her dark hair styled in a sophisticated updo that made her look remarkably like I had at her age. Sarah approached me hesitantly, her expression mixing pride with uncertainty. "Mom," she said quietly, "I wanted to congratulate you on tonight. This whole event, everything you've built with. The foundation, it's incredible. I had no idea you were capable of something like this." Her words were complimentary, but I could hear the underlying surprise in her voice, the implication that she had never imagined her mother could accomplish anything so significant. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," I replied, genuinely touched by her presence despite the complicated feelings it stirred up. "It means a lot to have you here." We walked together toward a quieter corner of the museum, away from the remaining clusters of guests and staff. "Mom, I owe you an apology," Sarah continued, her voice becoming more emotional. "When Dad divorced you, when all that business with Grandpa's will happened, I didn't really understand what was going on. I was angry about the family falling apart. And I guess I blamed you for not fighting harder to keep everything together." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But seeing what you've accomplished, seeing how you've used that inheritance to help so many people, I realized that I was wrong about everything." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest and meaningful exchanges Sarah and I had shared in years. She told me about her own struggles with relationships, her difficulty trusting people after watching her parents' marriage disintegrate, her confusion about what constituted real success and happiness. She had spent the past 3 years pursuing a high-stress career in finance, accumulating material possessions and professional accolades, while feeling increasingly empty and disconnected from any sense of purpose. "Watching you tonight," she said, "seeing how passionate you are about this work, how confident and happy you seem, it makes me wonder if I've been chasing the wrong things. You've found something that matters, something that makes a real difference in the world. I don't think I can say the same about my own life." I listened to my daughter's reflections with a mixture of sadness and hope. Sadness for the years we had lost, for the relationship that had been damaged by the chaos and pain of the divorce, but also hope for the possibility of rebuilding our connection on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. "Sarah," I said gently, "it took me 62 years to find work that felt truly meaningful. You have time to figure out what matters to you, what kind of contribution you want to make to the world. The important thing is that you're asking the right questions." We talked for another hour, sharing perspectives on everything from career, satisfaction to family relationships to the nature of true success. By the time Sarah left for her hotel, we had made plans for her to visit the Foundation's facilities the next day, to see firsthand the programs and services that had become the center of my new life. I went to bed that night feeling more hopeful about our relationship than I had in years, grateful for the possibility that something positive might emerge from all the pain and disruption of the past. The months following the gala brought a flurry of activity as we moved forward with the national expansion plans. Teams of architects, program developers, and site selection specialists worked to identify locations and design facilities for centers in Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, Atlanta, and Dallas. Each location presented unique challenges and opportunities, requiring customized approaches that reflected local conditions and community needs. The Seattle Center would be the first to open, housed in a beautifully renovated warehouse in a neighborhood that was undergoing significant redevelopment. The facility would serve as a pilot for some innovative programming ideas, including partnerships with local tech companies to provide computer training and job placement opportunities in the growing technology sector. But it was the Phoenix location that presented the most interesting challenge. The coalition of organizations that had invited us to establish a center there wanted to focus specifically on serving undocumented women who were particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse because of their immigration status. The legal and political complexities of serving this population required careful navigation, but the potential impact was enormous. Working with immigration attorneys and advocacy organizations, we developed programming that would provide services regardless of legal status, while also connecting women with resources for addressing their immigration situations. The approach required additional security measures and specialized staff training, but it opened up possibilities for serving a population that had few other options for assistance. Each new center represented not just an expansion of our services, but an opportunity to refine and improve our programming model. We incorporated lessons learned from the Portland facility, adapting our approaches based on what had worked well and what could be enhanced. The result was a more sophisticated and effective program that could be customized for different communities while maintaining the core principles that had made our work successful. The foundation staff had grown to include experts in program evaluation, quality assurance, and continuous improvement, ensuring that our services met the highest standards and achieved measurable outcomes. We tracked everything from job placement rates to housing stability to children's educational progress, building a comprehensive database that documented the long-term impact of our interventions. The data told a compelling story. 93% of women who completed our 18-month program were employed or enrolled in higher education at the time of graduation. 87% were living in stable housing situations 1 year after completing the program. Children of program participants showed significant improvements in academic performance and social adjustment measures. But beyond the statistics were the individual stories that illustrated the human impact of our work. Letters arrived regularly, from program graduates, sharing updates about career advances, educational achievements, new relationships, and personal milestones. Photographs showed smiling families in their own homes, women receiving diplomas and professional certifications, children participating in activities that would have been impossible during the crisis period that brought their families to our centers. One letter that particularly moved me came from Jennifer Walsh, the former teacher who had completed our program during the second year of operation. She had not only re-established her teaching career, but had been promoted to assistant principal at an elementary school in Portland. Her teenage daughter had received a full scholarship to study engineering at Oregon State University, and Jennifer had recently become engaged to a colleague who shared her passion for education and social justice. "Eleanor," Jennifer wrote, "I want you to know that you didn't just save my life. You gave me back my future. When I came to the center, I thought my teaching career was over, that I would never be able to provide a stable home for my daughter, that I had nothing left to offer the world. Your program didn't just give me job training and housing assistance, it reminded me of my own worth and capabilities. I am who I am today because you believed that I could be more than just a survivor." These letters and updates provided validation that our approach was working, that the comprehensive model we had developed was creating lasting change in women's lives. But they also served as reminders of the responsibility that came with the resources and influence I had gained. Every dollar spent, every program decision made, every policy established had the potential to affect real people in profound ways. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and energizing. It pushed me to continuously learn and improve, to seek out best practices from other organizations, to challenge my own assumptions about what was possible and effective. I enrolled in executive education programs at nonprofit management schools, attended conferences on social innovation and policy reform, and built relationships with other foundations working on related issues. The learning process was intellectually stimulating in ways that reminded me of my early years as a teacher, when I had been passionate about helping students discover their potential and achieve their goals. But now, instead of working with individual children in a single classroom, I was working with systems and programs that could affect hundreds or thousands of women and families. The scope of the impact was sometimes overwhelming to contemplate. If our model proved successful and was widely replicated, it could fundamentally change how society addressed domestic violence and women's economic vulnerability. The women we served today would become role models and mentors for others, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond our direct services. As the 5-year anniversary of William's death approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The grief and devastation I had felt during those first months after Richard left had been transformed into purpose and passion. The financial security that had seemed like an impossible dream had become a tool for creating opportunities for others. But perhaps most significantly, I had discovered parts of myself that had been dormant during my marriage, capabilities and interests that had never been fully explored or appreciated. The woman who had once doubted her ability to make independent decisions was now managing a multi-million-dollar foundation and influencing social policy at the national level. The personal transformation had been as profound as the professional one. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to speak with authority about subjects I cared about, to command respect in rooms full of powerful people. I had developed friendships based on shared values and mutual respect rather than convenience or social obligation. I had created a life that felt authentic and meaningful rather than simply acceptable. The contrast with my previous existence was stark. During my marriage, I had measured my worth by how well I supported Richard's ambitions and maintained our household. Success meant avoiding conflict and keeping everyone happy. Now I measured my worth by the impact I could make on other people's lives, by the problems I could solve, and the opportunities I could create. The change had not come without costs. My relationship with my children had been strained by the divorce, and its aftermath, though Sarah's presence at the gala suggested that healing was possible. I had lost friends who were uncomfortable with my new status and independence, people who preferred the quiet, accommodating Eleanor to the confident, outspoken woman I had become. But the gains far outweighed the losses. I had found work that engaged my mind and heart in ways that felt completely fulfilling. I had built relationships with people who valued my contributions and respected my leadership. I had created something lasting and meaningful that would continue making a difference long after I was gone. Most importantly, I had learned that it was never too late to discover who you really were, never too late to start over, never too late to build a life that reflected your values and utilized your capabilities. The inheritance had provided the resources and opportunity, but the transformation had come from within, from finally recognizing and embracing my own potential. As I prepared for the Foundation's board meeting where we would finalize plans for the next phase of expansion, I thought about William and the gift he had given me. His inheritance had been more than money, more than property, more than business assets. It had been an investment in the person he believed I could become, a vote of confidence in my character and judgment that had proved to be remarkably prescient. Looking out the window of my Portland home at the city spread below, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path my life had taken. The woman who had been told there was no space for her had created space for hundreds of others. The wife who had been discarded like an outdated possession had become a leader whose opinions were sought and respected. The future that had seemed so frightening and uncertain had become more rewarding and meaningful than anything I could have imagined. William had been right when he said that duty didn't always get rewarded the way people expected. Sometimes, it got rewarded in ways that were far more valuable than anyone could have dreamed. Sometimes it got rewarded with the chance to discover that you were capable of so much more than you ever knew. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.